Murmansk is a brand new class of submarine, and it's very capable, it's very quiet. So that's the most important thing, I think, in submarine warfare.
Deep beneath the Arctic ice, something is leaking. For decades, we were told these Soviet submarine wrecks were safe, sealed away in the freezing darkness where nothing could escape. But when scientists finally sent cameras down to investigate, what they recorded made their blood run cold. Radiation levels are 1,000,000 times higher than normal, plumes of poison billowing into the ocean, and dozens more wrecks we haven't even checked yet. The submarine in question is the K-278 Komsomlets, and understanding what happened to it requires going back to April 1989.
Nuclear-powered missile submarines became a key part of Western and Soviet deterrence.
At that time, the Soviet Union was still a superpower, locked in a tense standoff with the West. The Northern Fleet, based in the frigid waters near Murmansk, represented some of the most advanced military technology the Soviets had ever produced. And the Komsomlets was the crown jewel of that fleet. This wasn't an ordinary submarine. It was a one-of-a-kind vessel, the only one ever built in its class. What made it special was its construction. While most submarines use steel for their hulls, the Komsomlets was built almost entirely from titanium. This gave it an extraordinary capability. It could dive deeper than any submarine the Americans had, reaching depths of over 1,000 meters. That's more than 3,000 feet straight down, where the pressure would crush conventional submarines like tin cans. For the Soviet Navy, this was a tremendous achievement. It meant they had a vessel that could operate in parts of the ocean where Western submarines simply couldn't follow. On the 7th of April 1989, the Komsomlets was conducting operations in the Norwegian Sea. The official records state that at around 11 in the morning, a fire broke out in the rear section of the submarine, specifically in the 7th compartment. The cause was reported as an electrical short circuit, a spark that ignited insulation and other materials. In the confined space of a submarine, even a small fire can quickly become catastrophic. What followed was 6 hours of desperate struggle. The crew fought to control the blaze while dealing with cascading system failures. The fire damaged electrical systems throughout the vessel. The ballast tanks, which submarines used to control their depth by filling with water or air, stopped responding properly. Despite their efforts, the crew couldn't save their ship. The Komsomlets surfaced briefly, giving some crew members a chance to escape. But the fire was too severe. The submarine slipped beneath the waves and began its final descent. It sank to a depth of nearly 1,700 meters, coming to rest on the seafloor in international waters southwest of Bear Island. Of the 69 men aboard, 42 lost their lives. Some died in the fire itself. Others perished in the freezing waters of the Norwegian Sea while waiting for rescue. It was a tragedy that shocked the Soviet military establishment and marked one of the worst submarine disasters in naval history. For years afterward, the Komsomlets was primarily remembered as exactly that, a tragic accident and a memorial to the men who died. The submarine lay in deep, cold water far from shore. The assumption among many experts was that the extreme depth and low temperatures would essentially preserve the wreck and contain whatever dangers it posed. The thinking went that the conditions down there were so hostile that nothing could really escape or cause problems. Time would prove this assumption dangerously wrong. The issue is what the Komsomlets was carrying when it sank. Like all nuclear submarines, it had a reactor to power its systems. This particular reactor had a capacity of 190 megawatts. But that wasn't the most concerning cargo. The submarine was also carrying 2 torpedoes tipped with nuclear warheads. These weren't uranium-based weapons. They used plutonium, and each warhead contained approximately 12 to 13 kilograms of it. Plutonium is one of the most toxic substances known to science. It's not just radioactive in the conventional sense. If even a microscopic particle of plutonium is inhaled, it can lodge in the lungs and deliver a fatal dose of radiation over time. A single speck, invisible to the naked eye, can be lethal. And now there were dozens of kilograms of this material sitting in a deteriorating submarine on the ocean floor. For 30 years, scientists and governments largely maintained that the wreck posed minimal risk. Studies were conducted, and the general consensus was that the plutonium was stable inside the torpedo casings. The cold water and the depth were thought to limit any potential contamination. Norwegian authorities, whose fishing grounds and coastline were closest to the wreck, expressed periodic concerns, but there was limited action taken. That changed in 2019 when a joint Norwegian-Russian expedition decided to conduct a thorough investigation using modern technology. They deployed a remotely operated vehicle, essentially a sophisticated robot with cameras and sensors, down to the wreck site. The goal was to document the current state of the submarine and take measurements to see if there was any environmental impact. The footage the robot captured was sobering. The titanium hull, which had been celebrated for its strength and resistance to corrosion, showed significant deterioration. Patches of the surface were covered in rust and degradation that shouldn't have been there. Titanium is supposed to resist this kind of damage, but 3 decades of exposure to salt water under extreme pressure had taken their toll. Then the robot approached one of the ventilation pipes protruding from the hull. What the camera recorded at that moment changed everything. A cloudy plume was emanating from the pipe, puffing out into the surrounding water like smoke from a chimney. It was visible, it was measurable, and it was deeply alarming. The robot's sensors immediately registered elevated radiation levels. The team took water samples from inside and around this plume. When those samples were analyzed back in the laboratory, the results were shocking. The radiation levels inside the plume were up to 1 million times higher than the background radiation in normal seawater. This wasn't a small increase or a marginal elevation. This was a dramatic, unmistakable signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside the wreck. The primary culprit identified was cesium-137, a radioactive isotope that's particularly dangerous because of how it behaves in the environment. Cesium-137 is the same substance that contaminated vast areas around Chernobyl after the nuclear disaster there in 1986. What makes it especially concerning is that it mimics potassium chemically. Living organisms need potassium, so when cesium-137 enters the water, plankton absorb it thinking it's potassium. Small fish eat the plankton, larger fish eat the small fish. And eventually, these larger fish end up being caught by fishing vessels and sold for human consumption. The radioactive material works its way up the food chain, concentrating as it goes. The discovery proved something that many scientists had hoped wasn't true. The wreck is not contained. The salt water has been slowly eating away at the submarine's structure for 3 decades. The plutonium inside those torpedo warheads is breaking down. The reactor compartment is compromised, and radioactive material has been leaking out into one of the world's most productive fishing areas, possibly for years before anyone detected it. The pulsing nature of the plume suggested that ocean currents were washing through damaged sections of the submarine, carrying radioactive particles out in periodic bursts. This meant the contamination wasn't constant but variable, making it harder to track and predict. The Norwegian Sea supports major commercial fisheries. Cod, haddock, and other species caught in these waters feed millions of people across Europe. The thought that these fish might be swimming through or feeding in contaminated water was deeply troubling. What made the 2019 findings so significant was that they demolished the comfortable assumption that these deep-water wrecks could be safely ignored. The data was clear and undeniable. The Komsomlets isn't just a memorial or a piece of history. It's an active source of radioactive pollution, and it's been quietly contaminating the ocean while the world looks the other way. The recordings and measurements from that expedition proved that doing nothing was no longer an option, if it ever had been. The discovery at the Komsomlets wreck site was alarming enough on its own, but it prompted scientists to take a harder look at something even more disturbing. The Komsomlets sank as the result of an accident, a tragic fire that claimed dozens of lives. But it wasn't the only Soviet nuclear submarine resting on the ocean floor. In fact, it wasn't even close to being the worst of the problems. What researchers began to uncover was evidence of a systematic pattern of nuclear waste disposal that had been going on for decades, much of it deliberate. The focus shifted to the Barents and Kara Seas, the frigid waters north of Russia that served as the operational area for the Soviet Northern Fleet throughout the Cold War. These seas, remote and largely inaccessible for much of the year due to ice cover, became something of a dumping ground. According to official Russian reports released after the fall of the Soviet Union, the scale of what happened there is difficult to comprehend. The records indicate that between the 1950s and the early 1990s, the Soviet Navy intentionally scuttled or sank at least 19 ships that were loaded with radioactive waste. But that's just the beginning. They also disposed of approximately 17,000 containers of radioactive material by simply dropping them into the ocean. And perhaps most shockingly, they dumped 16 nuclear reactors, many of which still contained spent nuclear fuel. These weren't empty reactor housings. They were complete units with highly radioactive material still inside. The justification, when any was given, was typically economic. Properly decommissioning a nuclear reactor is expensive and technically challenging. It requires specialized facilities, trained personnel, and secure storage for the radioactive waste. In the chaos of the Soviet system, particularly during its later years, these resources were often unavailable. The solution they settled on was to simply sink the problem in the ocean and hope it would stay there forever. One of the most notorious cases involves a submarine designated K-278. This vessel was an early experimental design with a reactor system that was fundamentally flawed from the start. Instead of using water as a coolant, which was the standard approach, the K-278's reactor used liquid metal. The idea was that this would allow for higher temperatures and potentially more power output. In practice, it was a disaster. The reactor was constantly malfunctioning. It leaked radiation. It broke down repeatedly. The crew operating it faced constant exposure to elevated radiation levels. In 1968, the reactor had a serious accident that released a significant amount of radiation into the submarine itself. Several crew members became severely ill. The Soviet Navy tried for years to fix the reactor, attempting various repairs and modifications, but nothing worked. The submarine was essentially unusable. By 1982, they had given up. Rather than properly decommissioning the vessel, they made a decision that seems almost incomprehensible by today's standards. They towed the entire submarine out to the Kara Sea, to a location known as Stepovogo Bay, and deliberately sank it. The water there was relatively shallow, only about 30 meters deep, and critically, the reactor still contained approximately 360 kilograms of highly enriched uranium fuel. They just left it there on the bottom. The official explanation was that dismantling the reactor was too dangerous and too expensive. The liquid metal coolant had solidified in places, making the reactor extremely difficult to access. Any attempt to take it apart on land risked a catastrophic accident. But some researchers have suggested a darker possibility. They argue that the Soviet authorities realized the reactor design was so fundamentally unstable that attempting to dismantle it could trigger an uncontrolled reaction, potentially causing an explosion similar to what happened at Chernobyl, but possibly worse. According to this theory, sinking the submarine in a remote, shallow bay was seen as the only way to permanently contain what was essentially a floating bomb. By putting it underwater in an isolated location, they could ensure that if something did go wrong, the damage would be limited to that specific area, rather than contaminating populated regions or important naval facilities. Whether this theory is accurate or not, the fact remains that the K-278 is sitting on the seafloor with a substantial amount of nuclear fuel still inside. For decades, this was considered a closed chapter. The submarine was out of sight and largely out of mind. But the findings from the Komsomlets investigation changed that calculation. If a wreck in deep, cold water nearly 1,700 meters down was actively leaking radiation, what was happening to the K-27 inches shallow water, where wave action, storms, and temperature fluctuations were far more severe? Scientists began expressing serious concerns about the K-27's condition. The shallow depth means the wreck is subject to much more physical stress than deep water wrecks. Storm-driven currents can be powerful at 30 meters. Ice movements in winter can potentially impact the wreck, and the corrosion process happens faster in shallower, warmer water. Marine biologists and nuclear experts started warning that the reactor could become critical again, meaning a nuclear chain reaction could restart underwater. The scenario they worried about was genuinely frightening. If the fuel assemblies inside the reactor shifted, or if the cooling systems deteriorated in the right way, it might be possible for a sustained nuclear reaction to begin. The result would be a massive release of heat and radiation. In the confined space of the reactor compartment, This could lead to a steam explosion that would rupture the hull and spread radioactive material across a wide area. Some experts described it as a potential underwater Chernobyl. But the story of Soviet negligence with nuclear submarines doesn't end with Cold War-era disposal. One of the most disturbing incidents happened relatively recently. In 2003, long after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russia was supposedly cooperating with international partners on nuclear safety issues, the submarine K-159 had been decommissioned in 1989, the same year the Komsomlets sank. For 14 years, it sat rusting at a dock in Gremika, a remote naval base on the Kola Peninsula. The submarine was in terrible condition. Its hull was corroded and leaking. But crucially, its reactor compartment still contained approximately 800 kilograms of spent nuclear fuel. That's nearly a ton of some of the most dangerous material on Earth. The plan was to tow the K-159 to a facility where it could be properly dismantled and the nuclear fuel safely removed and stored. This was part of a broader international effort to help Russia deal with its massive backlog of decommissioned nuclear submarines. Western countries, including the United States, Norway, and others, were providing financial assistance for these dismantlement operations. What happened next still baffles experts who study nuclear safety. Rather than waiting for better weather or using proper equipment, someone decided to tow the deteriorating submarine across the Barents Sea in late August, at the start of storm season. The towing equipment consisted of old pontoons that were themselves in questionable condition, and inexplicably, they put a crew of 10 men aboard the submarine for the journey, essentially sending them along for the ride in a leaking, unpowered hull being dragged through rough seas. The predictable happened. A storm developed. The seas grew rough. The pontoons, struggling to support the weight of the submarine, began to fail. One by one, they broke loose. The K-159 started taking on water through its corroded hull. There was no power, no pumps, and no way to control the flooding. In the middle of the night, on the 30th of August 2003, the submarine sank in the Barents Sea. It went down in approximately 240 meters of water. 9 of the 10 men aboard died. Only 1 sailor survived. The sinking of the K-159 is officially classified as an accident resulting from poor planning and inadequate equipment. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looks like. But some observers have proposed a more cynical explanation. They point out that Russia was receiving international funding specifically to dismantle these old submarines. The money was supposed to cover the costs of safely defueling the reactors, cutting apart the hulls, and disposing of the radioactive materials properly. But what if the actual cost of dismantling the K-159 was higher than the funding they were receiving? What if the submarine was so contaminated, so structurally unsound, that shipbreakers refused to work on it? The theory suggests that the sinking might have been an intentional accident, a way to make an expensive problem disappear while keeping the international funding. Once the submarine is at the bottom of the ocean, recovering it becomes prohibitively expensive, and Russia could simply write it off as a tragic mishap. There's no definitive proof of this theory, but it would explain why such an obviously reckless plan was approved in the first place. Towing a decrepit, fuel-laden submarine through the Barents Sea in storm season using inadequate equipment seems less like a mistake and more like a guaranteed disaster. Whether through incompetence or design, the result was the same. Another nuclear wreck was added to the collection on the ocean floor, and 9 more men lost their lives. When you step back and look at the full picture, the scale becomes overwhelming. The Komsomlets, actively leaking plutonium and cesium into important fishing grounds. The K-27, a potential ticking bomb in shallow water with hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium. The K-159, a modern disaster created by either staggering negligence or calculated disposal. And these are just 3 submarines. The official counts suggest there are many more, scattered across the Arctic seabed, each one a potential environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. Research compiled after the Cold War indicated that these 3 wrecks alone contain more long-lived radioactive material than all the nuclear waste ever deliberately dumped in the oceans by every other country in the world combined. That single statistic captures the magnitude of the problem. Decades of Soviet naval operations, combined with inadequate disposal practices and occasional catastrophic accidents, have left the Arctic seas littered with radioactive time bombs. While the Arctic seas present a concentrated collection of highly dangerous individual wrecks, the Pacific Ocean tells a different story. The threat there isn't measured in a handful of catastrophic submarines sitting in deep water. Instead, it's about sheer numbers and proximity to populated areas. Near the city of Vladivostok, Russia's primary Pacific naval port, lies what locals have come to call the Submarine Cemetery. Vladivostok is a major city with a population of over 600,000 people. It serves as the headquarters of Russia's Pacific Fleet and has been a crucial naval hub since the 19th century. But just offshore, in bays and inlets that look deceptively peaceful from a distance, lies something far more sinister. Dozens upon dozens of decommissioned submarines, many of them nuclear-powered, have been left to rust in shallow water for more than 3 decades. This isn't a single wreck site like the Komsomlets. This is an entire fleet of abandoned vessels. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it left behind one of the largest submarine forces ever assembled. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy had built hundreds of submarines, and by the late 1980s, many of the older vessels were reaching the end of their operational lives. The plan was to decommission them systematically, properly removing the nuclear fuel, dismantling the reactors, and scrapping the hulls for materials. But the collapse of the Soviet Union brought that process to an abrupt halt. The funding disappeared. The specialized facilities that handled nuclear decommissioning were suddenly operating without budgets. The trained personnel either left for other work or weren't being paid. And so the submarines just sat there, tied to old piers or partially sunk in muddy bays, waiting for a dismantlement process that never came. Satellite imagery and photographs from local explorers who have ventured into these areas paint a truly apocalyptic picture. You can see conning towers jutting out of the water at odd angles, hulls half submerged in mud with vegetation growing on exposed sections, rows of submarines clustered together, their steel corroding away year after year. Some reports suggest there were over 100 submarines in various states of abandonment in this region at the peak of the crisis. What makes this particularly dangerous is that many of these vessels were nuclear-powered, and the decommissioning process was incomplete, or never started at all. Properly decommissioning a nuclear submarine is an extraordinarily complex operation. The reactor core contains spent fuel rods that are intensely radioactive. These need to be carefully removed using specialized equipment and trained personnel. The fuel rods must then be placed in shielded containers and transported to secure storage facilities designed to hold them for decades or even centuries until the radioactivity decays to safe levels. This process is expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. A single submarine can take years to properly decommission, and the costs can run into the tens of millions of dollars. In the chaos of the 1990s, as Russia struggled with economic collapse and political upheaval, these decommissioning operations simply stopped. The submarines were left where they were, and in many cases, their nuclear reactors remained inside, still containing spent fuel. These aren't abstract threats sitting miles offshore in deep water. These are hulks corroding in shallow bays right next to a major city. The saltwater is eating away at the hulls constantly. Every year that passes, the structural integrity of these vessels decreases. Reactor compartments that were designed to contain radiation are slowly failing. The shielding that protects the environment from the fuel rods is deteriorating. But beyond the environmental threat, there's another concern that some security analysts have raised, one that ventures into more speculative but deeply troubling territory. What if this graveyard of nuclear submarines isn't just being ignored? What if it's being exploited? The theory goes something like this. Here you have an unguarded collection of nuclear technology sitting in relatively accessible shallow water near a coastline. While the Russian military maintains some presence in the area, these decommissioned hulks aren't under the same level of security as active naval vessels or nuclear facilities. For a rogue state or non-state actor interested in acquiring nuclear technology or materials, this could represent an unprecedented opportunity. The concern isn't necessarily that someone would steal an entire reactor or try to remove weapons-grade material, although even that might be theoretically possible with enough resources and planning. The more immediate worry is about components and knowledge. A nuclear submarine reactor contains sophisticated pumps, control systems, shielding materials, and instrumentation. These components, while not directly weapons applicable, could be valuable to any organization trying to understand nuclear technology. Some analysts have suggested that these wrecks could serve as a kind of training ground. Small dive teams could potentially access the less guarded hulks, practice cutting through reactor compartments, and learn how nuclear systems are put together. They could take photographs, make measurements, and remove small components for study. All of this could be done relatively quietly, and in the chaos of dozens of abandoned submarines spread across multiple sites, it might go unnoticed for quite some time. This isn't just paranoid speculation. The region has a history of nuclear accidents that demonstrates just how dangerous these facilities can be, even under professional supervision. In August 1985, at a shipyard in Chazma Bay, not far from Vladivostok, one of the worst nuclear accidents in naval history occurred. Workers were conducting what should have been a routine operation, refueling the reactor of a nuclear submarine. The process involved removing spent fuel rods and installing fresh ones, but something went catastrophically wrong. A combination of procedural violations and equipment failures led to an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction inside the reactor core. The result was a massive thermal explosion. The power surge generated so much heat so quickly that it essentially blew the reactor apart. The force of the blast was sufficient to lift the reactor's 20-ton lid and hurl it into the air. A column of radioactive steam and particles shot thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles around. The explosion instantly killed 10 sailors who were working near the reactor. Dozens more were severely injured by radiation exposure and burns. A fire broke out immediately after the explosion and burned for hours, spreading contamination across the shipyard and surrounding area. The radioactive plume drifted over land and water, depositing cesium, strontium, and other dangerous isotopes across a wide zone. The hills around the bay, the docks, the buildings, everything was contaminated. The Soviet government kept the accident secret for years. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that details began to emerge. When nuclear safety experts finally had access to the full information, they realized this had been one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, comparable in some ways to Chernobyl, though on a smaller scale and in a more remote location most of the world had never heard about. The official investigation concluded that the accident was caused by violations of safety procedures during the refueling operation. Workers had apparently removed control rods improperly, allowing the reaction to restart in an uncontrolled manner. But some researchers have proposed an alternative explanation. They suggest that the reactor wasn't simply being refueled, it was being deliberately pushed beyond its normal operating parameters. According to this theory, the engineers were conducting a stress test, intentionally running the reactor at higher power levels to see how much output they could achieve before something failed. They were treating a live nuclear reactor like an experimental testbed, pushing it harder and harder to find its breaking point. The 10 men who died weren't just victims of careless procedure violations, they were casualties of a reckless experiment that went disastrously wrong. Whether this theory is accurate or not, the incident demonstrates something crucial. These reactor systems, even when supposedly under control and being handled by trained personnel at an official facility, can fail catastrophically. The Chazma Bay explosion contaminated the exact region where dozens of abandoned submarine hulks now sit rotting. The submarine cemetery at Vladivostok exists in a zone that's already been poisoned by nuclear contamination from previous accidents. The wrecks are deteriorating in water that flows through an area used by commercial fishing vessels. The structural failures that worried scientists about deep-water wrecks are happening here too, but in shallow water where the effects are more immediate and potentially more dangerous. International cooperation has made some progress on this problem. Programs funded by the United States, Japan, Norway, and other nations have helped Russia dismantle dozens of old nuclear submarines over the past 2 decades. Specialized facilities have been built. Trained crews have been assembled. The work continues, slowly and expensively. But the submarines that remain are the hardest cases. They're the ones that are most contaminated, most structurally compromised, and most expensive to deal with safely. Every year of delay means more corrosion, more structural failure, and more risk. The threat isn't a sudden catastrophic release like might happen with the K-27. The threat here is a slow, steady leak of radioactive material into a busy harbor area that's also a productive fishing zone. The recordings from this region aren't dramatic footage of radiation plumes. They're satellite photos showing the steady decay of dozens of nuclear hulks. They're the testimony of survivors from Chashma Bay. They're the measurements showing elevated radiation levels in sediment samples from the bays where these submarines rest. Together, they paint a picture of a problem that remains urgent and unresolved more than 30 years after it began. While most of the concern around Soviet submarine wrecks focuses on environmental contamination and the slow leak of radioactive materials into the ocean, there's one wreck where the story is entirely different. This particular submarine became the target of one of the most ambitious, expensive, and secretive intelligence operations in American history. The radiation leaking from it wasn't the concern. What mattered was what might be inside, and what secrets it could reveal. The submarine was the K-129, a Gulf II-class ballistic missile submarine of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. In early 1968, at the height of the Cold War, it departed on what should have been a routine patrol in the Pacific Ocean. The submarine was armed with 3 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, standard armament for this class of vessel. Its mission was to remain at sea, stay hidden, and be ready to launch its missiles if ordered to do so. But sometime in March 1968, the K-129 stopped communicating with its base. The Soviet Navy waited for the scheduled check-ins, but nothing came. Days passed with no contact. Search operations were launched, with Soviet ships and aircraft scouring the patrol areas where the submarine should have been operating. The Soviets searched for weeks, but found nothing. The K-129 had simply vanished with all 98 crew members aboard. What the Soviets didn't know was that the Americans had found it. The United States Navy operated a network of underwater listening stations throughout the Pacific, part of a system designed to track Soviet submarine movements. These hydrophones had recorded something unusual in early March. They had picked up the sound of an implosion, the distinctive acoustic signature of a submarine hull collapsing under pressure as it sank to extreme depth. Using the timing and location data from multiple listening stations, American analysts were able to triangulate roughly where the sound had come from. The USS Halibut, a specially equipped American submarine designed for underwater reconnaissance, was sent to investigate. After weeks of searching, they found it. The K-129 was sitting on the ocean floor, approximately 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The depth was staggering, nearly 5,000 meters down. That's over 16,000 feet, roughly 3 miles of water above the wreck. From an intelligence perspective, this was an extraordinary discovery. Here was a Soviet nuclear submarine, complete with missiles, nuclear warheads, codebooks, and cryptographic equipment. If the CIA could somehow access the wreck, the intelligence value would be immense. The obvious problem was the depth. No diver could reach it. No conventional salvage equipment could operate at that depth or lift something as heavy as a submarine. So the CIA decided to create it. The operation was given the code name Project Azorian. The challenge wasn't just technical. The operation needed a cover story. The CIA approached Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire industrialist, with a proposal. Hughes would publicly announce that he was funding a deep-sea mining operation to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was just plausible enough to work as a cover story. Under this cover, construction began on the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a ship over 600 feet long with a massive opening in its center. The ship was equipped with a gigantic mechanical claw, internally called Clementine, designed to descend 3 miles to the ocean floor, grasp a submarine, and lift it back up. Construction and preparation took years. The ship was finally ready in 1974, 6 years after the K-129 had sunk. The massive claw was lowered and began its 3-mile descent. Using cameras and sonar, operators guided Clementine to the wreck. The claw was positioned around the submarine's hull, and the mechanisms engaged. Then came the slow process of lifting. According to the CIA's version, the claw successfully grasped the submarine and began lifting it. But as it ascended, the corroded hull began to fail. About halfway up, a large section of the submarine broke away and fell back to the ocean floor. The part that broke off was supposedly the section containing the missiles and the code room. What the Glomar Explorer did recover was approximately a 40-foot section of the forward hull, along with 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and various equipment. That's the official story, but several alternative theories have emerged. The first suggests that the breaking apart story is itself a cover, and that the CIA actually recovered everything they wanted, but needed to explain why they weren't attempting a second mission. A second theory questions whether the K-129 was on a normal patrol at all, suggesting it might have been involved in a rogue operation. The third and darkest theory suggests the submarine was actually sunk by an American submarine, and Project Azorian was primarily a cover-up to recover evidence before the Soviets could find it. What's certain is that Project Azorian cost over $800 million in 1970s money. The entire operation nearly remained secret, but in 1975, journalists broke the story. When reporters contacted the CIA for comment, officials refused to confirm or deny anything about the operation. That phrase became standard practice, now known as the Glomar response, and it's still used by intelligence agencies around the world. The K-129 story illustrates something important about these submarine wrecks. They're not just environmental hazards or historical curiosities. They're time capsules containing technology, secrets, and the final moments of lost crews. These wrecks represent ongoing challenges that don't simply go away because they're hidden beneath miles of water.